I would now like to introduce Dr. Manuswita Tapata, who studied biology at Creighton and earned her MD at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And Dr. Tapata's talk is entitled Unexpected Lessons from Medicine.
All right. Thank you so much for having me, Dr. Haas. My talk is titled Unexpected Lessons from Medicine. So let's dive in here. A little bit of a disclaimer before I start. This is my perspective. It's one perspective. It comes from my personal experiences, so I definitely don't need to speak for everyone in medicine. So just letting you know that. So it's 5:30 p.m. Yes, p.m. I zombie walk into the bathroom, and in about a half an hour, I'm ready. I'm working nights. I'm a resident doctor in training, and by 6 p.m. I'm driving to the hospital. When I get there, the intensive care unit is overflowing. That's the ICU. There are no beds, I overhear as I walk down the hall. It was a pretty familiar phrase during most of my training, and even now. I'd become accustomed to hearing it. I learned that there's 2 new patients that are being flown into the hospital. So I walk over to the cafeteria and I try to get some coffee to start my morning, which is really my night. And as I'm pouring, as the hot liquid kind of pours into my cup, I hear adult code blue, room 203. Adult code blue, room 203. So I leave the coffee behind, do a quick U-turn, I run down the stairs, and I run into nurses and respiratory therapists that are also on their way to the room. I walk in, I introduce myself, and I stand at the foot of the bed and I run the code. I don't know this patient or what led to his decline. At this point, all I know is this patient didn't have a pulse and wasn't breathing. I quickly gather information and make treatment decisions and to make sure that everybody in the room has a role and that we're moving care forward. My supervisor walks in and I give her an update. Moments later, she's called away to another patient who isn't doing well. Then my phone starts to ring. The family in 405 would like an update. I'm dealing with an emergency, I say. I'll stop by as soon as I'm done. After several attempts, we're able to resuscitate our patient and we take him to the ICU. Told you that one. There are no beds, I hear again, another familiar phrase. I tell everyone there has to be a bed. So I work with our hospital administrators and nurses and I make sure that there's a bed and we take the patient down to the ICU. Ring, ring, there's another patient who has a blood clot in her lungs. As I try to deal with that, ring, ring, the transfer patient has arrived. And so I decide I'm going to go see the transfer patient, and I'm listening to her lungs, and I get another call. Ring, ring, now the patient in 408 has a heart rate of 160 and isn't looking good. I apologize to this family member, and I go and deal with the person with the high heart rate. As I'm looking at her EKG tracing and deciding what to do, I decide I need to order medications for this high heart rate. Ring, ring, another patient has arrived. Okay, I'll be there as soon as I can, I say, and I return to signing medication orders for that patient with the high heart rate, and I realize that I'm putting them into the wrong patient chart. So I take a breath. I call my supervisor and I ask if she's able to help. She goes to assess one of our new patients, and my shift continues on and on and on until we make it to the morning. That was a really hard night, and it wasn't very common in that sometimes it was worse. Things were much, much more hectic and crazy during the pandemic, and sometimes it was much less intense. And so every day I'd go home and I would fall right into bed and I'd wake up again at 5:30 and I'd do it over and over again. And this is what I did for 80 hours a week working as a resident doctor, which is a doctor in training. Working this schedule several weeks in a row over the course of many years can be pretty taxing. Not every night is like that, as I mentioned, and some nights are better and some nights are worse. So when I was sitting where you guys are 12 years ago, I knew this would be hard. Everyone told me medicine is hard, this career is going to be hard. And I thought, well, I can do hard things. You know, I've taken organic chem and physics, and I've sat through Dr. Haas's philosophy class, and I've done all the honors courses. I've done leadership. I was in like every club. I was president of this or that, and I would do research in the lab at night, and then I'd go home, and I thought, I can do hard things because I've dealt with loss, I've dealt with failure, I've dealt with all of these hard things. And what I didn't realize is while that all of that is really hard, the things that hit me the hardest were things that I totally didn't expect. It wasn't the studying for the boards. It wasn't all the hard things I had prepared for. So today, the point of my talk is really to share my reflections on what made this period of my life and my medical training so challenging, and what are the lessons that I learned. So we'll start with number 1, which is lack of control. Number 2 is lack of certainty. And number 3 is this immense responsibility that you feel as a doctor. So lack of control is that working with humans, the nature of it is that it's unpredictable. People get sick when they get sick. People get sick at the same time. There's also larger issues like there are no beds, as we kept hearing, that are really outside of one person's control. There's also issues with healthcare workers and, the idea that it was me and my supervisor at night in an overflowing ICU. That was what was happening during the pandemic. Then there's also issues like requirements or training, which are really, really intense. And you need them to be intense so that you can become very practiced and thorough. But also, you want to be able to sleep and recognize your own limitations. So there's kind of conflict there. The second thing is lack of certainty. So life is really lived in the gray, as maybe many of you guys know. But I wish and I thought that medicine had the exact right answer for everything, but that's just not true. There's so much more nuance, and so much depends on who the patient is, what their history is, what is the decision that you're going to make, what are the allergies that you have to take into consideration, the side effects of those medications that you might be prescribing. And in reality, we take really great care to try to weigh the risks and benefits of any decision and try to make the best decision we have at the moment. And then sometimes I think one of the examples is that patient that I had with a blood clot, she actually was bleeding into her back. So we needed to put her on a blood thinner, but also that would risk increasing the bleeding. So there's no right answer, and both of those decisions are bad, but you still have to make a decision. So making a decision through uncertainty was something that I had to learn. And the last thing is immense responsibility. It's our responsibility, because these are real people's lives, these are real patients, that we do the best we can for our patients. But the reality of being human is that doctors are human and we're not perfect, and it's impossible to never make a mistake. I never want to make a mistake because it means that it affects a person's life, but also I can't never ever make a mistake. And most of the times it's something small. So if I made a medication error, the pharmacist would catch it, the nurse would catch it, somebody would try to catch it. There's systems in place, but sometimes it's bigger, and yet there's no way to avoid those things from happening. So I think one question I asked myself is there a way that I could have known this before I started, or was there a way I could prepare for this? And I think I came to the conclusion that there's no way for me to know exactly how hard this would be. There was no way for me to predict the pandemic would happen during my medical training. So then how do you make a decision when you can't know everything about what might happen? So I'll give you some suggestions. If you're like me, you like to go to 10 Wally's and you try all these samples, you try all these ice cream scoops, and you try the sample and then you pick one, right, based on the sample that you've chosen, and then you get a full scoop. Sometimes I'm like, well, this is great, I love the vanilla or the pear, avocado, whatever it is. And then sometimes you realize, this is a lot. Like I can't eat the whole thing. I liked the sample, but I didn't like the full thing. So how do you make that decision? You tried sampling it, but you still had to, you changed your mind once you got the full thing. And so that's ice cream, so whatever. But when you make a real big decision, like a career choice, the stakes are much higher. You can, of course, sample things. You can do internships, you can shadow people, you can talk to people in the field and hear their stories. And that's a great approach. You should definitely do that. But I think the truth is, regardless of how much experience you try to get, there's always going to be a surprise. And I couldn't have predicted many of the things that happened. And things are always going to be harder than you thought they would be. So I really didn't know what I didn't know. And so what I wanted to focus on now is how do you navigate these unexpected challenges that you're definitely going to encounter? And the only thing you can do is make the best decision you have in the moment with the information you have. And then you have to give yourself grace and realize that you're not psychic. You can't predict everything. So that here's how you navigate this, right? Or how I did it, at least. So number 1 is control what you can. Number 2 is acknowledge uncertainty. And then number 3 is reflect and reach out. So for control what you can, so much was out of my control, but what I knew that I could do is control specific things like the interest that I had. How do I create a rotation? I worked with my mentor and I created a rotation in an area of medicine that I really enjoyed. I try to be creative. I try to realize that there's more than one way to do something to get the same result, and then spend time really focusing on your interests so you balance out the hard stuff with stuff that you really, really enjoy. And the second thing is acknowledging uncertainty. This was a really, really challenging thing for me because I'm a person who likes to plan. I have a 10-year plan, a 15-year plan, and those plans just don't work out. And so what do? And I really learned you have to hold 2 opposing things at once, and you have to be okay with 2 bad decisions, and how do you make a decision even though those are both bad choices, or at least they're not the ideal choice. And then the way I did the acknowledging uncertainty is really that I would acknowledge to both my patients and my students when I didn't know something. I'd say I don't really know what the exact right decision is, but here's my thoughts, here are the nuances, and try to explain it to them. And I think me being able to explain that I don't know the answer helped them understand that it's okay for them not to know either, and that we'll make this decision together. And then lastly, I think this was my favorite thing, is reflecting and reaching out. I was a big journaler in college too. So I have a journal, and it's one way that I process the unpredictability and the gravity of the work that I do. And then the second thing is finding people like my co-residents or my co-medical students that are going through the same things, dealing with the same challenges, but also finding mentors who have done this before, who've been through similar challenges, and finding a way that they can help me based on their previous experience. So, to kind of conclude here, if you ever find yourself waking up at 5:30 p.m. going to a really stressful environment, remember to breathe, number one, when things get overwhelming. And then focus on what you can control, acknowledge what you don't know, and reach out when to people who are going through similar things as you. Thank you.